Hello everyone, welcome to today's episode on Aletheia, and we shall be considering the miracle of the resurrection. In our last episode, we looked at the medical and historical evidence of the death of Jesus on the cross, because as we say, if there is no death, there can be no resurrection. But talking about the death of Jesus, let's even assume for a moment that he did not die on the cross. Just an assumption that he did not die on the cross. Let's assume that he was flogged with all the whips that we have considered in a previous episode. He was flogged, he was whipped, he was spat on, he was nailed to the cross. But let's assume that by some miracle, he did not die. He escaped death from the cross. When he was brought down from that cross, do not forget he was pierced as a confirmation that he died. But we are seeing, let's assume he did not. Do you think it is possible for such a person to be alive and seen just 3 days after all those things happened? I consulted with a few medical friends of mine, and one of the things that they said is after a major surgery, for instance, a CS surgery, where the person's body has to be opened and some things have to be brought out, I was told that it would take months, almost a year, for that wound to be closed up. Whether it's delivery through CS or it's an operation to remove a fibroid or whatever, it will take months for the person to be healed. Now imagine Jesus just after 3 days. He was seen not by one, not by two, but by certain persons. He was seen by the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, and then he was seen by the 11 disciples, because as of this time Judas was no longer with them. And subsequently, he was seen, according to the Apostle Paul, by over 500 persons. It is practically impossible for someone, after 3 days, going through everything that he went through, to be seen eating fish and bread. If we assume that Jesus went through all of that, shouldn't he be in a coma for the next 4 months? For the next 6 months? Shouldn't his legs be hung up with a thread in a hospital somewhere? Shouldn't he be walking with crutches after 8 months? Yet, it was recorded that he died. So we aren't even talking about coma, we aren't talking about injuries alone, we are talking about death. And yet 3 days later he's alive. It is practically impossible unless God was responsible. And that is why it is called the miracle of resurrection. Brothers and sisters, it is the only explanation here. And that is why the apostles of Jesus, they were willing to die for what they saw and what they believed. But then, what are the evidences that the resurrection actually happened? Let's find out. I would like to present 4 evidence that the resurrection did happen. The first evidence is the empty tomb. The tomb was empty, and this was testified to by both the disciples of Jesus, the women that first went there, and the soldiers. The challenge with the soldiers is this: when they went to the Pharisees and the Sadducees to tell them about the empty tomb, they were told to tell a lie and that they would be covered. And the lie was this: the disciples came overnight and picked his body and made it look as though he had resurrected. There is a problem with that narrative anyway. Let's assume that that was true and that the disciples came overnight and picked his body. Yet, just after 3 days, Jesus was seen walking around on the streets, as recorded with his visit to the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, and also eating fish as recorded with his disciples. How do you make sense of someone who was seen by over 500 persons, was seen eating fish and bread, and yet you say he died, but his disciples came to take him overnight? That narrative doesn't hold water. The second evidence is the testimony and the sufferings of the apostles. Why would they allow themselves to be killed on account of the resurrection? Like the apostle rightly says, we are witnesses of his resurrection. And that was why they were killed. That was why they were being beaten. If you remember in Acts chapter 5 verse 40, the apostles Peter and John were called and flogged and warned to stop speaking in the name of this Jesus. But when they went outside, what happened? They began even to declare more boldly, and they gave God thanks, who had counted them worthy to share in the sufferings of Christ. Why were they being flogged? Why were they being killed? If their testimony was not true, why were people doing things to make sure that they were suppressed? The question I know you have will be, what if they were motivated? What if they were offered things? I would like to throw that back to you. Is there anything that has been offered to you that you were willing to die for? That was a lie? You know that it's a lie, and you were willing to die for it? It's almost practically impossible. What we know for are people who may have been brainwashed or who have been hallucinated. I'm talking about hallucination. Were the apostles hallucinated? The people that Paul speaks about, over 500 of them, that saw Jesus at once, were they hallucinating? I spoke with a friend of mine who is a doctor of psychology for many years now and based in the US. And I asked him, is it possible to hallucinate over 200 persons at once? And I mean, this is a recent research. And he said to me that in 2025, we do not yet have the technology to hallucinate 50 persons at once. In 2025, with all the AI technology, with all the nanotechnology, we still do not have the tools to make people hallucinate at once, 50 of them. To think that these people had the technology in the first century to hallucinate 500 persons, we've got to be kidding ourselves. They were not motivated. They were not hallucinating. The only other option left is to say that they indeed were telling the truth. They were willing to die for it. They were willing to be flogged for it. And actually, they were flogged and they died for it. But yet, not one of them recanted their story. The third evidence I would like to put forward to you is the man named Saul, or, if you may, Paul. If you ask a good attorney, whether a defense attorney or a prosecutor attorney, they will tell you that the best evidence or witness is to get someone from the opposing side to support your claim. You will easily win a case quickly. And that's what Paul is. In Acts of the Apostles, chapter 8 from verse 3, we find out that Paul was going around destroying houses, destroying people, and arresting as many as he could. By Acts of the Apostles chapter 9, his rage against Christianity had heightened, and he wasn't satisfied with his jurisdiction in Jerusalem, so he sought for letters from the high priest to go to Damascus to see if there were Christians there and arrest them and bound them and bring them to Jerusalem. That was someone on the opposing side. Take for instance the persecution. And suddenly he switched sides claiming he had an encounter with this resurrected Christ, who told him many things, who appeared to him and said he was going to be his servant and all of that. And in chapter 9 of Acts of the Apostles, Paul, who was on the side of the prosecution, switched to the side of the defense. And the Bible recorded that on account of that, there was great peace amongst the church. Paul was a living witness of the resurrected Christ. The fourth evidence for the resurrection is what I call contemporary expert witness account. And this is simply getting testimonies from those who have investigated the situations around the resurrection, either legally or through investigative journalism. Now, I have 5 persons and I would like to read out their verdicts around the resurrection, right? The first person is Sir Lionel Loku. He existed around 1914 to 1997. And this is what he said after applying legal standards of evidence, cross-examination style analysis, and credible tests to the resurrection account. I will quote what he says. He says, "I say unequivocally that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance by proof, which leaves absolutely no room for doubt." The first person I would like to talk about is Sir Lionel Loku, and he existed around 1914 to 1997. He holds the Guinness World Record for the most murder trial wins in a row, 245 or so. And this is what he says after applying legal standards of evidence, cross-examination style analysis, and credibility tests to the resurrection accounts. This is what he says. "I say unequivocally that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance by proof, which leaves absolutely no room for doubt." The second person is Dr. Simon Greenleaf, and he existed around the 18th century to the 19th century AD, and he was a Harvard Law School professor. In fact, his text happens to be the most influential 19th century legal text on evidence. It is called A Treatise on the Law of Evidence. And he concluded that the apostles' accounts met the highest standards of credible eyewitness evidence, and that they could not have been fabrications without someone breaking under prosecution. The third person would be Lord Darning. He lived around 1849 to 1936, and he was the former Lord Chief Justice of England. This is what he says, and I quote, "In its favor as living truth, there exists such overwhelming evidence, positive and negative, factual and circumstantial, that no intelligent jury in the world could fail to bring in a verdict that the resurrection story is true." The fourth person on our list is J.N.D. Anderson, and he was the Dean of Faculty of Law at the University of London, and in fact, he was an expert in Islamic law. And he saw that the resurrection was the only explanation for the transformation of the disciples and the birth of the early church. And finally, Frank Morrison. He was a former British journalist and lawyer. He tried to debunk the claims of the resurrection purely from a legal, historical context, but he found otherwise, and he had no choice but to acknowledge that the resurrection was true. These 5 and many others happened to have even tried to debunk the resurrection from the place of skeptics and atheists, but eventually they found the resurrection to be true. The claims of the Christian faith rises and falls on a very solid ground, and indeed it rises because the resurrection is a true story of history. If you're a Christian out there, I want to encourage you and I want your faith to be strengthened. The Christian faith is a legit faith. In our next series, we shall be considering the foundation for Christian living. I hope to see you soon. Please follow us on all our social media handles, on Instagram, on Facebook, on YouTube. See you soon. God bless you.